Money is a spirit, how to give it orders. There is an old suspicion, buried in the language we use without noticing it, that money is not a dead thing. We say it flows. We say it moves. We say a man has no feel for it, or that it slips through his fingers, or that it finds him wherever he goes. We speak of it the way our ancestors spoke of winds and rivers and spirits that could be courted or offended. This is not an accident of speech. It is a memory of something true that the modern world has trained us to forget. Money behaves less like a tool sitting quietly in a drawer and more like an entity that responds to the character of the one who holds it. It rewards certain men and abandons others, not through magic, but through a kind of obedience that flows in only one direction. It obeys command. It does not obey desire, and it certainly does not obey need. The man who begs money to stay finds it leaving faster. The man who commands it with a settled, unshaking will finds it arranging itself around him like iron filings around a magnet. This is the first thing to understand before anything else can be built. You are not dealing with a mechanism. You are dealing with a servant who can smell weakness on you before you have said a single word. The ancients who studied the human soul, the Stoics chief among them, never wrote a manual about compound interest or market timing, and yet they understood the mechanism of wealth more precisely than most modern financial teachers do, because they understood the mechanism of the self. Their central insight was brutally simple. Some things are within your power, and some things are not. Your judgments, your effort, your discipline, your response to circumstance, these are yours. Your reputation, other people's opinions, the rise and fall of markets, the inheritance you were or were not given, these are not yours. Money sits in a strange place in this division. It is an external thing, indifferent in itself, either good nor evil, and yet the way you relate to it is entirely internal, entirely yours to command. This is the door through which spirit language enters. You cannot control the money. You can only control the posture of the one who approaches it. And it turns out that posture is almost the entire game. Picture two men standing at the edge of the same opportunity. One approaches with his hand out, trembling, already rehearsing what he will say if he is refused, already imagining the shame of failure before it has happened. The other approaches upright, unhurried, indifferent to whether this particular door opens, because he knows another will. Every person on the other side of that opportunity, whether they can name it or not, feels the difference between these two men within seconds. Desperation has a smell, and it repels resources the way a predator's scent clears a forest. Command has a smell too, and it draws resources the way calm water draws thirsty animals to its edge. Nothing supernatural is occurring here. It is simply that money, like all human affairs, is mediated by other humans, and other humans are exquisitely sensitive to the emotional state of the one asking something of them. The spirit you must master first is not out there in the market. It is the one living inside your own chest. Seneca, a man who was at various points spectacularly wealthy and spectacularly close to ruin, wrote to his friend Lucilius that it is not the man who has too little who is poor, but the man who craves more. He was not romanticizing poverty, and it would be a grave misreading to use his words as an excuse for laziness or a justification for staying small. He was pointing at something far more useful than a platitude. He was describing an internal state that either commands resources or is commanded by their absence. A man ruled by craving is a man who has handed over the reins. He will make decisions from fear rather than clarity. He will take the desperate deal instead of the good deal, because desperation cannot wait for good. He will chase every rumor of quick wealth because his hunger has outpaced his judgment. Craving is not ambition. Ambition can be cold, patient, and strategic. Craving is hot, impulsive, and blind. The spirit of money senses this difference instantly and treats the two men very differently, one as a partner worth investing in, the other as prey worth consuming. Consider the story, half legend and half history, of Diogenes living in his barrel in the marketplace of ancient Corinth, while Alexander the Great, the most powerful man alive, stood before him and offered to grant him any wish. Diogenes, famously, asked only that the emperor step aside because he was blocking the sun. This is usually told as a story about contempt for wealth, but it is better understood as a demonstration of command. Diogenes did not need anything from Alexander, and because he needed nothing, he was free to speak to him as an equal, or even as a superior. That freedom, that absence of need, is the exact posture that draws resources toward a person rather than away. It is not that Diogenes was poor and therefore virtuous. It is that Diogenes was internally sovereign, and sovereignty is magnetic in every domain of life, including the financial one. The lesson is not to reject money. The lesson is to reach the internal state where you could reject it, and only then to accept it on your own terms. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire that spanned continents, wrote privately in his journal, in words never meant for an audience, that a man's worth is measured by the worth of the things he cares about. This line deserves to be sat with rather than skimmed. If you care most about money itself, you become its servant, checking accounts obsessively, feeling your mood rise and fall with every fluctuation, defining your entire identity by a number that other people control through their willingness to trade with you. But if you care about mastery, about discipline, about the quality of your work and the integrity of your dealings, money becomes a byproduct rather than a master. It arrives as evidence of your character rather than as the thing your character exists to chase. This inversion is the entire secret of giving orders to money instead of taking orders from it. You do not command wealth by focusing on wealth. You command wealth by focusing on the version of yourself that wealth is naturally drawn to serve. The vessel matters more than the liquid you hope to pour into it. Every teacher who has claimed to unlock financial success through a secret technique or a hidden formula has skipped the part where they build the person capable of holding what the technique produces. Give a large sum of money to a man who has not built discipline, and watch how quickly it disappears, not because the money was cursed, but because nothing in his internal architecture was built to contain it. Lottery winners who return to poverty within a few years are not victims of bad luck. They are demonstrations of a law as consistent as gravity. The vessel determines what can be held. This is why the Stoic project, the daily practice of examining your judgments, strengthening your will, and training your reactions, is not a detour from the pursuit of money. It is the actual foundation the pursuit of money must be built upon, whether anyone admits this or not. There is a particular kind of language that either commands money or begs it, and most people speak the begging dialect without realizing it. Listen to how often a person says they cannot afford something, as though affordability were a fixed and permanent verdict rather than a temporary condition subject to change through effort. Listen to how often a person says money is tight, as though tightness were an external weather system rather than a description of choices made and habits formed. This language matters because it trains the mind to occupy the identity of a subject rather than a sovereign. The words you use about money become the frame through which you perceive every opportunity that touches it. A man who says he cannot afford something has closed the door before checking whether it was locked. A man who instead asks how he could afford it has kept the door slightly open, has activated the part of his mind responsible for solving problems rather than the part responsible for surrendering to them. This is not magical thinking. It is applied attention, and attention, more than any other resource, decides what a person notices, and what a person notices decides what a person can act upon. Fear is the emotion most responsible for a person losing command over their financial life, and it disguises itself so well that most people never recognize it as the source of their bad decisions. Fear masquerades as caution when it causes a person to avoid every risk, even reasonable ones, and stay frozen in situations that are slowly draining them. Fear masquerades as urgency when it causes a person to grab at the first opportunity that appears, without examining it, because the discomfort of uncertainty feels unbearable. Fear masquerades as loyalty when it keeps a person in an underpaying job out of guilt or obligation long after the arrangement has stopped serving them. The Stoics train themselves daily to sit with the discomfort fear produces without letting it dictate their choices, through practices like imagining the worst outcome in vivid detail and realizing it was survivable. This same practice, applied directly to money, disarms its power almost immediately. Imagine losing the income you fear losing. Imagine the business failing that you are afraid to start. Walk through it fully, in your mind, without flinching. Most people discover the imagined catastrophe is smaller than the catastrophe of never having tried. Scarcity is not the same thing as having little. Scarcity is a mental architecture, a way of perceiving the world as a closed system where every gain for someone else is a loss for you. A man gripped by scarcity thinking cannot celebrate another person's success without feeling diminished by it. He cannot share information freely because he suspects it will be used against him. He hoards not because hoarding is wise, but because his internal model of the world tells him there will never be enough. This model, more than any actual lack of resources, is what keeps people poor across generations. The opposite posture, one the Stoics modeled through their emphasis on shared human reason and cooperative virtue, treats the world as far more abundant and far more responsive to effort than scarcity thinking allows. This does not mean pretending resources are infinite, which would be foolish. It means recognizing that human ingenuity, effort, and exchange create new value constantly, and that a person operating from abundance notices and seizes these creations while a person operating from scarcity remains blind to them, defending a small territory instead of building a larger one. Discipline is the daily ritual through which command over money is actually exercised, not as an abstract virtue but as a series of concrete, repeated actions. The man who tracks every dollar leaving his hands is not being petty. He is establishing sovereignty over a domain that would otherwise govern itself according to impulse. The man who saves a portion of every payment before spending anything else is not depriving himself. He is teaching money that he is the one giving instructions, not the one waiting for permission to survive until the next payment arrives. These small, unglamorous rituals accumulate into something that looks, from a distance, like luck, but is in fact the compound interest of discipline applied consistently over years. Nobody sees the 1,000 quiet decisions that built the fortune. They only see the fortune, and they call it fortunate, missing the truth that fortune of this kind is manufactured, not discovered. If you want money to obey you, you must first prove, through repeated daily evidence, that you are capable of governing yourself. Nothing exposes weak self-governance faster than money, and nothing rewards strong self-governance more reliably over the long arc of a life. Debt, in its most dangerous form, is not simply owing money. It is the reversal of the command relationship, the moment where you begin taking orders from an obligation rather than issuing orders to a resource. A person deep in high-interest debt experiences this reversal directly. Their labor no longer serves their own goals first. It serves the interest payments first, and only the leftover scraps serve them. This is why the Stoics, despite writing almost nothing directly about credit instruments unknown to their era, would recognize immediately what is happening to a person trapped this way. Their freedom has been sold, piece by piece, often for conveniences that gave only momentary pleasure. Reclaiming command in this situation is rarely comfortable. It requires a period of deliberate discomfort, cutting expenses that once felt necessary, delaying gratifications that once felt automatic, in order to sever the obligation and return the labor of your hands to the service of your own future. This process is not punishment. It is liberation, even when it feels, in the middle of it, like restriction. The temporary tightening is what makes the eventual sovereignty possible. Generosity, properly understood, is not the opposite of financial command but one of its highest expressions. A person who gives from fear, worried that refusing a request will damage their reputation, is not being generous. They are being controlled by the opinions of others, and money leaves their hands as a form of appeasement rather than a form of power. A person who gives from strength, having already secured their own foundation and choosing deliberately to direct resources towards something they value, experiences giving as an exercise of command rather than a loss of control. This distinction explains why some of the wealthiest and most secure people in history were also remarkably generous, not despite their security but because of it. Giving became one more domain where their will, rather than their fear, determined the outcome. If you want to test whether you have begun to command money rather than be commanded by it, examine how giving feels to you. If it feels like bleeding, you are still ruled by scarcity. If it feels like directing a river you have already tamed, you have begun to master the spirit this entire message is describing. Comparison is one of the fastest ways to lose command over your own financial life, because it hands the steering wheel to people who are not driving your vehicle and never will. The moment you measure your progress against a neighbor's new purchase, a former classmate's promotion, or a stranger's curated display online, you have stopped setting your own terms and started reacting to someone else's performance. Epictetus, who began his life enslaved and ended it as one of the most respected teachers of his era, insisted that comparing your circumstances to another's is a guaranteed path to misery, because you are measuring things that were never within your control against a standard that keeps moving. Financial comparison is especially cruel because it is almost always based on incomplete information. You see the car, not the debt that financed it. You see the vacation, not the anxiety hiding behind the smiling photograph. Building genuine command over money requires you to close this comparison loop entirely and replace it with a single, private standard, whether you are more disciplined, more capable, and more secure today than you were a year ago. That standard cannot be manipulated by anyone else's curated appearance, and it is the only standard that produces steady, compounding progress instead of anxious, reactive spending. Patience is perhaps the most undervalued financial virtue in a culture addicted to speed, and it is precisely the virtue the Stoics spent their entire philosophical tradition cultivating. Nature itself, they observed, does not rush. A tree does not produce fruit in its first season, and a person who dug it up after 1 year to check on its roots would destroy the very growth they were impatient to see. Wealth built through steady, compounding effort behaves exactly the same way. The gains are invisible for long stretches, then suddenly obvious, and the people who quit during the invisible stretch never live to see the sudden visibility. Command over money requires the same equanimity the Stoics applied to every other domain of life. An ability to act consistently without demanding immediate proof that the action is working. This is not passive waiting. It is active patience, continuing to do the disciplined thing, the saving, the investing, the skill building, while resisting the emotional demand for instant confirmation. Markets fall and recover. Businesses struggle before they stabilize. Skills feel useless right up until the moment they become indispensable. The person who commands money is the person who can hold steady through all of this without panicking, because panic is simply fear given the wheel. There is a difference between working for money and working with mastery, and this difference determines almost everything about how much command a person eventually holds over their financial life. A person working purely for money treats every task as a transaction, done reluctantly, done only as far as required, resented the entire time it is being performed. This posture produces mediocre work, and mediocre work produces mediocre compensation, because the market, whatever its flaws, is remarkably good at sensing effort and rewarding it over time. A person working toward mastery treats the same task as an opportunity to become excellent at something, and this pursuit of excellence, rather than the pursuit of payment, is what actually produces outsized financial results. This sounds paradoxical until you notice how consistently it plays out. The craftsman obsessed with his craft outturns the craftsman obsessed only with his invoice, because customers, employers, and markets all gravitate toward quality with a kind of gravitational certainty. Money follows mastery far more reliably than it follows desperation, which means the fastest path to commanding money is often to stop staring directly at it, and instead stare at the skill that produces it. Anxiety about money and command over money cannot coexist in the same mind at the same moment, which is why regulating your emotional state is not a soft, secondary skill but the central discipline this entire subject depends on. A mind gripped by anxiety narrows its own field of vision, focusing entirely on threat and losing the capacity to notice opportunity even when it is directly in front of it. This is a documented feature of how fear operates in the human nervous system, not a moral failing, but understanding the mechanism does not make it any less costly. The Stoic practice of separating your judgments about a situation from the situation itself is the most direct antidote available. The bill arriving is a fact. The story you tell yourself about what that bill means about your worth, your future, and your competence is a judgment, entirely separate from the fact, and entirely within your power to revise. Training yourself to catch this separation in real time, to notice when you have slid from observing a fact into spiraling through a judgment, restores the calm, wide field of vision that allows good financial decisions to be made instead of panicked ones. Every person eventually faces a financial setback severe enough to test whether their command over money was real or only performed during easy conditions. A business fails. A job disappears without warning. An investment collapses. These moments reveal character with brutal clarity, because character revealed under pressure is the only character that was ever genuinely there. The Stoics called adversity the training ground of virtue, insisting that a person untested by hardship cannot know the true strength of their own resolve, only its comfortable appearance. A financial setback handled with panic, blame, and paralysis confirms that the earlier calm was circumstantial rather than structural. A financial setback handled with clear assessment of what remains within your control, followed by deliberate, unhurried action on exactly those things, confirms that command was real all along. This is not a suggestion to welcome hardship for its own sake, which would be a strange and unnecessary form of self-punishment. It is a recognition that hardship will arrive regardless of your preference, and the only meaningful choice available to you is how you meet it when it does. Identity is the quiet architecture underneath every financial decision a person makes, and most people never examine it directly, which is exactly why it continues to run their lives unchallenged. If your private identity includes the belief that you are simply not a money person, every decision you make will unconsciously confirm that belief, because human beings are remarkably consistent at behaving in accordance with the story they carry about themselves. Changing this story is not a matter of empty affirmation, repeating a phrase without evidence behind it. It is a matter of accumulating small, factual proof that contradicts the old identity, one disciplined choice at a time, until the new identity has enough evidence behind it to feel true rather than performed. The Stoics understood identity as something actively constructed through habitual choice rather than something passively discovered, which places enormous responsibility, and enormous freedom, in the hands of anyone willing to use it. You are not stuck with the financial identity you inherited from your family, your culture, or your early failures. You are only stuck with it for as long as you continue feeding it with choices that confirm it rather than choices that override it. If any part of this has been useful to you so far, this is the moment to subscribe to the channel, because everything covered here is only the surface of a much deeper body of work being built for people who are serious about applying ancient discipline to modern struggles, including the struggle with money. New material like this is released regularly, and subscribing ensures none of it passes you by. This channel exists to help you build the internal architecture strong enough to hold whatever external resources arrive, and that project never really finishes, it only deepens. Take a moment now, tap subscribe, and let this become a standing appointment with your own growth rather than a one-time encounter. The relationship between labor and money deserves closer examination, because most people misunderstand what they are actually being paid for. They believe they are paid for time, and this belief quietly sabotages their entire financial trajectory, because time is a fixed and shrinking resource, and no amount of discipline can create more of it. In truth, the market pays for value delivered, for problems solved, for skills applied, and time is simply the container these things happen to occur within. A person who understands this distinction begins optimizing for value rather than for hours, developing skills that solve larger problems, taking on responsibilities that affect wider outcomes, and building assets that produce value even while they sleep. This is the mechanism behind wealth that scales, the difference between a person paid for output that is inherently capped by a body's limited hours and a person paid for output that multiplies independently of their direct presence. Commanding money at this level requires a shift from thinking like a laborer trading hours to thinking like an architect building systems, and this shift is available to nearly everyone willing to make the internal transition, regardless of their current starting position. Envy deserves separate treatment from ordinary comparison because it carries a uniquely corrosive quality, a desire not just to have what another person has but for that other person to lose it. This emotion, left unexamined, poisons decision-making in ways that are difficult to detect from inside it. A person driven by envy makes financial choices designed to prove something to a rival rather than choices designed to serve their own long-term interests, buying possessions to outshine someone, taking risks to spite someone, refusing sound advice because it came from someone they resent. The Stoics treated envy as one of the clearest signs of an unexamined mind, because it locates your sense of worth entirely outside yourself, dependent on constant comparison with people you did not choose and cannot control. Uprooting envy requires the deliberate, repeated practice of celebrating the success of others as evidence that success is achievable rather than as a threat to your own position. This reframe alone, practiced consistently, changes the emotional texture of an entire financial life, replacing constant low-grade resentment with a clear-eyed focus on your own disciplined progress. Attention is the currency beneath all other currencies, and the person who cannot command their own attention will never reliably command their money, because every financial decision begins with what a person chooses to notice and think about. A mind saturated with distraction, constantly pulled toward trivial entertainment, constantly reacting to notifications and outrage and comparison, has almost nothing left over for the sustained, quiet thinking that good financial decisions require. The Stoics practiced daily reflection specifically to reclaim this kind of attention, setting aside time each morning to clarify intentions and each evening to review actions, creating small islands of undistracted thought in the middle of otherwise chaotic days. Applying this same discipline to money means setting aside deliberate time, free from distraction, to review your financial situation honestly, to plan your next moves clearly, and to notice opportunities that a scattered mind would have missed entirely. This is not about becoming obsessive. It is about giving money the same quality of attention you would give any relationship you actually wanted to succeed, because in a very real sense, that is exactly what this is. Reputation and integrity form the long-term infrastructure through which financial opportunity actually travels, far more than most people realize while they are focused on short-term tactics. A person who treats every transaction as an isolated event to be won at the other party's expense may extract a short-term gain, but they simultaneously destroy the possibility of future opportunity from that same source, and word of this behavior travels further than most people expect. A person who treats every transaction as one instance within an ongoing relationship, worth protecting even when protecting it costs something in the moment, builds a reputation that begins working on their behalf even when they are not present to advocate for themselves. The Stoics placed enormous emphasis on justice as a cardinal virtue precisely because they understood that a life lived in right relationship with others is more stable, more sustainable, and ultimately more prosperous than a life built on exploitation, however profitable exploitation might appear in the short run. Command over money that is built on broken trust is fragile command, vulnerable to collapse the moment the deception becomes visible. Command built on integrity compounds quietly for decades, often outlasting the person who built it. There is a particular freedom that arrives once a person no longer needs to prove their worth through visible spending, and this freedom, once tasted, becomes one of the most powerful financial advantages a person can hold. The need for external validation drains resources constantly and invisibly, financing purchases meant to signal status rather than purchases meant to serve genuine need or genuine joy. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself often that very little is actually needed to live a good life, and that the pursuit of external approval is a trap that consumes far more than it delivers. A person who has internalized this teaching stops financing their identity through their possessions and starts financing their actual goals instead, redirecting resources that would have gone towards status symbols into savings, investment, education, and the kind of quiet security that never needs to announce itself. This is not asceticism for its own sake. It is a redirection of capital away from performance and towards substance, and the compounding effect of this redirection over a decade or two is almost impossible to overstate, separating those who appeared wealthy from those who actually became wealthy. Every act of financial discipline is, at its core, an act of self-respect, a decision that your future self deserves the same consideration your present self is constantly demanding. Impulsive spending, in this light, can be understood as a subtle form of self-betrayal, sacrificing the interests of the person you will become in order to satisfy the appetite of the person you are right now. The Stoics were relentless about the idea that the self worth caring for is not the momentary, reactive self, but the enduring, rational self that persists across time and must live with the consequences of today's choices. Building command over money, then, is really an extension of building command over the relationship between your present impulses and your future welfare. Every time you choose the disciplined action over the comfortable one, you are casting a vote for the person you intend to become, and every time you choose comfort over discipline, you are casting a vote for staying exactly where you are. Neither vote feels dramatic in the moment. Their cumulative effect, over years, is the entire difference between the two lives you might have lived. Uncertainty is a permanent condition of financial life, not a temporary inconvenience waiting to be resolved by enough planning or enough information, and learning to act decisively within uncertainty is one of the highest financial skills a person can develop. Markets shift. Industries transform. Opportunities that look stable disappear, and opportunities nobody predicted suddenly open. The Stoics trained specifically for this reality, insisting that wisdom is not the elimination of uncertainty but the capacity to act well despite it, guided by reason rather than paralyzed by the impossibility of perfect information. A person waiting for complete certainty before making any financial move will wait their entire life, because complete certainty about the future has never existed for anyone, in any era. The discipline instead is to gather reasonable information, apply sound judgment, act, and then adjust based on what actually unfolds, treating each decision as provisional rather than final, correctable rather than permanent. This posture removes the paralyzing weight of needing to be right in advance, and replaces it with the far more achievable standard of needing to respond well as reality reveals itself. Simplicity, deliberately chosen rather than imposed by circumstance, is one of the most underrated financial strategies available, because a simplified life requires less money to sustain and therefore grants enormous flexibility to the person living it. A person with genuinely modest needs can take risks a person burdened by an expensive lifestyle cannot afford to take, can walk away from a toxic job a person locked into large fixed expenses cannot leave, can weather a downturn a person overextended on obligations cannot survive. The Stoics practiced voluntary simplicity not as a performance of virtue but as a practical exercise in reducing their dependence on external circumstances, testing themselves periodically by eating plain food or wearing plain clothes, just to prove to themselves that their contentment did not actually depend on luxury. Applying this today does not require austerity as a permanent condition. It requires an honest audit of which expenses genuinely serve your well-being and which merely serve a habit or an image, followed by the courage to cut the second category loose. The resulting margin between income and expense becomes the single largest source of financial flexibility and command a person can create. The command relationship this entire message describes is ultimately reciprocal, and this reciprocity is easy to miss if you focus only on the discipline required from your side. Money, treated as a spirit that must be given orders, responds not to harsh domination but to competent, consistent stewardship, the same way a skilled rider commands a horse not through cruelty but through clear, confident signals the horse learns to trust. A person who treats money carelessly, spending without attention, borrowing without a plan, investing without study, will find that money behaves erratically around them, arriving and vanishing with no discernible pattern. A person who treats money with attentive respect, tracking it, planning for it, learning its behavior across markets and cycles, will find that it becomes progressively more predictable and more responsive to their intentions, not because the money itself has changed, but because the relationship has matured. This maturation cannot be rushed, and it cannot be faked. It is built the same way any long-term relationship of trust is built, through consistent, demonstrated reliability over an extended period of time. Legacy is the final horizon this entire subject eventually points toward, whether a person consciously acknowledges it or not, and the Stoic framework offers a particularly clarifying lens for thinking about it. Marcus Aurelius, ruling the most powerful empire of his era, wrote to himself that the fame of even the greatest names eventually fades into forgetting, and that clinging to the idea of lasting recognition was itself a form of foolishness. This is not a discouragement from building wealth across a lifetime. It is an invitation to build it for reasons more substantial than personal glory, to think about what your discipline makes possible for the people who come after you, and for the causes you believe deserve support beyond your own lifetime. A financial life commanded well, rather than merely accumulated anxiously, becomes something that can be handed forward, teaching children not just money itself but the internal architecture required to command it, breaking cycles of scarcity that might otherwise repeat themselves for generations. This is perhaps the deepest form of giving orders to the spirit of money, extending your command beyond the boundary of your own lifetime into the lives of people you may never meet. None of what has been shared here comes with the promise of a specific outcome, because the Stoics themselves were adamant that outcomes belong to fortune while effort and character belong entirely to you, and honesty requires holding that same line here. What can be said with confidence is that the internal shifts described throughout this message, from craving to command, from scarcity to abundance, from fear to patience, from comparison to a private standard, are the same shifts observed again and again in people who eventually did build lasting financial stability across very different circumstances and very different starting points. The work is internal before it is external. The ledger changes only after the mind that reads the ledger has changed first. This is slower than any headline promising instant transformation, and it is also more durable than anything those headlines have ever delivered, because a mind rebuilt from the inside does not collapse the way a lucky windfall so often does. If this message has given you something worth carrying forward, subscribing to this channel is the simplest way to make sure the next one reaches you, and there will be a next one, built on these same foundations, going deeper into the specific practices that translate ancient discipline into modern financial command. This channel is built for people who want their inner life and their outer circumstances to finally move in the same direction, and every new video adds another piece to that structure. Subscribe now, so the work already done here does not stand alone, and so the work still ahead of us has a place to reach you. Boredom and restlessness quietly sabotage more financial plans than any market crash ever has, because the discipline required to command money is rarely dramatic and almost never entertaining. Checking a budget, reviewing an account, saying no to an unnecessary purchase for the 100th time, these actions do not produce the emotional charge that reckless spending or impulsive risk-taking provides, and a mind trained on constant stimulation begins to experience steady discipline as a kind of suffering. The Stoics anticipated this exact weakness, describing the pull toward novelty and excitement as one of the mind's oldest traps, mistaking the absence of stimulation for the absence of progress. Real financial command often looks, from the outside, almost boring, the same modest choices repeated month after month without fanfare, and learning to find quiet satisfaction in this repetition, rather than restlessly seeking the next thrill, is itself a form of mastery. The people who eventually reach genuine security are rarely the ones who move the fastest. They are the ones who tolerated the tedium longest without abandoning the process out of boredom. Blame is a comfortable place to live and an extremely expensive one, because every dollar of attention spent resenting a past decision, an unfair employer, or an unlucky circumstance is a dollar of attention not spent building the next move. The Stoics drew a hard line here that many people resist, insisting that once an event has occurred, arguing with it accomplishes nothing, and the only productive question left is what happens next. This is not the same as pretending injustice does not exist or that circumstances are always fair, because they plainly are not. It is a recognition that indignation, however justified, does not itself produce a single dollar of income or a single hour of opportunity. A person who has fully internalized this stops narrating their financial history as a story of what was done to them and starts narrating it as a story of what they are choosing to do now, regardless of how the story began. This shift alone, uncomfortable as it can be to make, restores an enormous amount of usable energy that blame had quietly been consuming. Small leaks sink large ships, and this old warning applies with unusual precision to personal finance, where the habits that erode command are rarely dramatic and almost always disguised as harmless. A subscription forgotten and never cancelled, a convenience purchase repeated daily without a second thought, a small debt allowed to linger because the payment feels manageable, none of these individually threaten a person's stability, and this is precisely why they survive scrutiny for years. The Stoics practiced close, honest self-examination specifically because they understood that character is built or eroded in exactly these small, unglamorous moments rather than in the rare dramatic ones. Applying the same close examination to a monthly statement, tracing every recurring charge back to its source and asking honestly whether it still earns its place, is unglamorous work that produces outsized results precisely because almost nobody bothers to do it consistently. Command over money is assembled from 1,000 small audits like this one, not from a single sweeping resolution made once and then forgotten. The stories a family tells about money are often inherited long before a person earns their first dollar, and these inherited stories operate quietly in the background of every financial decision until they are dragged into conscious view and examined. A household where money was discussed only through anxiety and conflict often produces adults who flinch from financial planning entirely, avoiding statements and conversations because the subject itself has become associated with distress. A household where money was discussed with shame around asking for help produces adults who overextend themselves rather than admit difficulty. Recognizing these inherited scripts is not about assigning blame to the people who raised you, most of whom were themselves simply repeating what they had inherited. It is about recognizing that a script written by someone else's circumstances does not have to remain the operating system for your own life. The Stoic emphasis on examining your judgments applies with particular force here, because very few judgments run as deep or as invisibly as the ones absorbed in childhood about what money means and what it says about a person's worth. Skill acquisition deserves to be treated as a financial strategy in its own right, not merely as career development happening somewhere in the background of the real financial work. Every hour invested in becoming genuinely excellent at something the world values is an hour invested directly in your future earning capacity, often with a return that outpaces almost any traditional investment available to a beginner with limited capital. The Stoics valued the cultivation of practical wisdom precisely because they understood that a well-trained mind is an asset no market downturn, no theft, and no bad luck can take away once it has been built. Financial command, in this light, begins long before the first dollar is saved or invested, in the deliberate decision to become someone whose time and attention are worth more to the market than they were yesterday. This is available to every person willing to commit to it, regardless of their starting resources, because skill, unlike capital, can be built with nothing more than time, attention, and consistent practice, the very ingredients the Stoics considered most fully within anyone's control. Silence around money, the reluctance to discuss it honestly with a partner, a mentor, or even yourself, allows small problems to grow into large ones entirely undisturbed. Many people can name their weight or their blood pressure but cannot name their own net worth or their monthly spending with any precision, not because the information is unavailable but because looking directly at it feels uncomfortable enough to avoid. The Stoics practice radical honesty with themselves as a daily discipline, reviewing their actions each evening without flinching from what they found, understanding that improvement is impossible without an accurate accounting of the present. Breaking the silence around your own financial reality, sitting down and looking honestly at every number, however uncomfortable, is often the single most powerful act of command available to someone who has been avoiding it. The discomfort of looking is almost always smaller and shorter than the discomfort of continuing not to know, and on the other side of that discomfort is the clarity every subsequent decision in this message depends upon. Risk is often misunderstood as something to be eliminated entirely, when the more accurate Stoic framing treats risk as something to be measured, accepted deliberately, and separated cleanly from recklessness. A reckless decision is made without study, driven by impatience or excitement, indifferent to the actual odds involved. A calculated risk is made after careful assessment, with a clear understanding of what could be lost and a settled willingness to accept that loss if it occurs, because the potential gain justifies it on reflection rather than on impulse. The person who never takes any risk at all is not practicing safety. They are practicing a different kind of surrender, one where the erosion of inflation and lost opportunity works against them just as steadily as any market downturn would, only more quietly and without any accompanying drama. Command over money requires the courage to accept calculated risk without flinching, paired with the discipline to walk away from reckless risk without regret, and confusing the two categories is one of the most common and most costly errors a person can make across an entire financial lifetime. Opportunity cost is a concept the Stoics would have recognized instantly, even without the modern economic vocabulary used to describe it, because their entire philosophy rests on the understanding that every choice forecloses other choices, and wisdom lies in choosing deliberately rather than by default. Every dollar spent on something of little lasting value is simultaneously a dollar that cannot be invested, saved, or directed towards something that would have compounded in significance over years. This is rarely felt in the moment of spending, because the foreclosed alternative is invisible, an absence rather than a presence, and absences are notoriously difficult for the human mind to register with any emotional weight. Training yourself to see the invisible alternative before a purchase is made, to ask honestly what this money could have become instead, restores a dimension of financial reality that impulsive spending habitually hides from view. This is not a call to deprive yourself of every pleasure, which would be its own kind of imbalance. It is a call to make the exchange consciously, with full awareness of what is being traded away, rather than unconsciously, as though the alternative never existed at all. Negotiation is a skill most people quietly avoid because it exposes them to potential rejection, and this avoidance costs far more over a lifetime than most people ever calculate. Every unasked question, every unchallenged price, every accepted offer that was never tested against a better one, represents money left unclaimed not because it was unavailable but because asking felt uncomfortable. The Stoics trained themselves specifically to separate the discomfort of a social interaction from any actual harm, recognizing that embarrassment, however unpleasant it feels, does not injure the body or the soul the way genuine harm would. Applying this distinction to negotiation strips much of its terror away. The worst realistic outcome of asking for a better price, a higher salary, or improved terms is usually a simple refusal, uncomfortable for a moment and then forgotten, while the best outcome can shift a financial trajectory meaningfully. A person who commands money learns to treat negotiation as a normal, expected part of nearly every transaction rather than a rare and frightening exception, and this single shift in expectation alone recovers resources that a more passive approach quietly forfeits year after year without ever announcing the loss. There is an important difference between money and wealth that the Stoics, though they never used these exact modern terms, would have understood intuitively through their broader distinction between appearance and substance. Money is the number in an account, easily measured, easily displayed, and easily lost. Wealth is the underlying capacity that produces money reliably, the skills, relationships, health, and discipline habits that continue generating value even after a particular sum has been spent or lost. A person who has accumulated money without building underlying wealth is perpetually one setback away from ruin, because nothing beneath the surface is capable of regenerating what was lost. A person who has built genuine wealth, even if their current account balance is modest, possesses something far more durable, an internal capacity that can rebuild a financial position repeatedly regardless of external disruption. This is why some people recover from bankruptcy within a few years while others, who lost the same amount of money, never recover at all. The difference was never really about the money. It was always about what had or had not been built underneath it. Teaching children about money deserves more deliberate attention than most households give it, because a child absorbs far more from watching how their parents actually behave around money than from anything explicitly taught in a single conversation. A parent who models calm, disciplined, unhurried decision-making around finances is teaching a lesson more durable than any lecture, while a parent who models anxiety, secrecy, or impulsive spending is teaching an equally durable lesson, whether they intend to or not. The Stoics believed strongly in education through example rather than instruction alone, understanding that character is transmitted through observed behavior far more effectively than through abstract advice. If you want the next generation in your life to inherit command over money rather than fear of it, the most powerful curriculum available to you is simply the visible evidence of your own daily discipline, your own calm response to setbacks, and your own willingness to discuss money honestly rather than treating it as a forbidden or shameful subject. Children absorb posture before they absorb principles, and the posture you model today is quietly becoming their inheritance. Gratitude might seem an unlikely financial discipline, more suited to spiritual practice than to wealth building, and yet the Stoics considered it one of the most practical tools available for maintaining a clear, undistorted view of one's own circumstances. A mind constantly focused on what is lacking becomes progressively blind to what is already present and already working, and this blindness produces decisions rooted in perceived deprivation rather than accurate assessment. Regularly and deliberately noticing what is already functioning well in your financial life, however modest, retrains attention away from the distortions that scarcity thinking produces. This is not a suggestion to feel satisfied with less than you are capable of achieving, which would undermine the entire ambition this message has been built around. It is a recognition that gratitude and ambition are not opposites, and that a person who can genuinely appreciate their current position while still working deliberately to improve it operates from a far steadier emotional foundation than a person whose ambition is fueled entirely by dissatisfaction. Steadier emotional foundations produce better decisions, and better decisions, repeated consistently, produce better outcomes. Consistency will always outperform intensity in the long run of a financial life, even though intensity is far more exciting to imagine and far more likely to be celebrated in the moment it occurs. A person who saves a modest, steady amount every single month for 20 years will typically end up further ahead than a person who saves nothing for long stretches and then attempts a dramatic, intense burst of saving whenever guilt or fear briefly takes hold. The Stoics prize steady, repeated practice over occasional dramatic gestures precisely because character, like compound growth, accumulates through repetition rather than through isolated intensity. This is a difficult truth to sit with in a culture that celebrates dramatic transformation stories and rarely celebrates the quiet, undramatic discipline that actually produced most durable financial security. If you are searching for the single highest leverage habit available to you, it is not a clever trick or a rare insight. It is simply the willingness to repeat the correct, modest action longer than anyone else is willing to repeat it, without needing the process to feel exciting in order to continue. The myth of the sudden breakthrough, the single lucky deal or fortunate discovery that changes everything overnight, does real damage to people who believe it too literally, because it quietly excuses years of inconsistency while everyone waits for a moment that statistically almost never arrives in the form imagined. Even the stories that appear sudden from the outside almost always conceal years of unglamorous preparation that simply were not visible to observers who only noticed the dramatic final moment. The Stoics warned repeatedly against depending on fortune, precisely because fortune is unreliable by definition, arriving or withholding itself according to forces entirely outside anyone's control. What remains reliably within control is preparation, and preparation sustained long enough eventually intersects with opportunity in a way that can look, from the outside, exactly like luck. Waiting for a breakthrough instead of building steady preparation is a bet against your own agency, handing the outcome of your financial life to chance rather than claiming it through discipline. The people who eventually experience what looks like a breakthrough are almost always the same people who had already been quietly preparing for it long before anyone else noticed them. A daily or weekly review of your financial position, brief and unemotional, functions for money the way the Stoic evening reflection functioned for character, a small, repeated act of honest accounting that prevents drift from accumulating unnoticed. Without this review, small deviations from your plan compound silently, and by the time they become visible they have often grown large enough to require painful correction. With this review, small deviations are caught early, while they are still easy and inexpensive to correct, long before they harden into habits or debts that demand far more effort to unwind. This practice does not need to be elaborate or time-consuming to be effective. A few honest minutes, checking what came in, what went out, and whether both align with your stated intentions, is enough to maintain the kind of ongoing command this entire message has been describing. The discipline is not in the complexity of the review. It is simply in its consistency, performed without fail, whether the numbers that week are encouraging or difficult to look at directly. Courage is required at nearly every meaningful financial threshold, not the dramatic courage of a single heroic act, but the quieter, more persistent courage of continuing to act correctly while uncertainty remains unresolved. It takes courage to invest when markets feel unstable, to negotiate when rejection feels possible, to start a venture when failure has not yet been ruled out, and to maintain discipline when the results are not yet visible enough to provide reassurance. The Stoics considered courage one of the 4 cardinal virtues precisely because they understood how much of a well-lived life depends on acting rightly despite fear rather than waiting for fear to disappear before acting at all. Fear rarely disappears on its own schedule. It simply becomes more manageable through repeated exposure to the exact situations that once triggered it. Every financial decision made courageously, even when the outcome remains uncertain, strengthens the capacity to make the next courageous decision more easily, until a person who once felt paralyzed by financial uncertainty finds themselves acting with a steadiness that once seemed impossible to reach. Health, though rarely discussed as a financial subject, is deeply entangled with financial command, because a body and mind depleted by exhaustion, poor sleep, or chronic stress make measurably worse decisions than a body and mind that are well rested and well regulated. The clearest thinking, the patience required for negotiation, the discipline required for consistent saving, all draw from the same limited well of energy that physical neglect steadily drains. The Stoics treated the body as the instrument through which the rational mind conducts its work in the world, worthy of disciplined care not out of vanity but out of practical necessity. Neglecting sleep to work longer hours,